Okay, welcome back to part 2 of the video lecture for chapter 1 on evolutionary biology. You'll recall at the end of the first part of this video lecture, we had just finished going through the basically multi-step reasoning process that Darwin went through to develop his model of natural selection, which was his mechanism for how he proposed that evolution occurred. So this was in the late 1830s, early 1840s. In the early 1840s, Darwin begins writing a manuscript, preparing an essay, a long essay, basically sort of laying out his theory of evolution by natural selection. He finishes that manuscript in 1844, but decides not to publish it because he fears a public uproar. The reason he feared that, and probably rightly so, is because he's essentially saying that natural processes are responsible for the production of species, not God. And so he's kind of taking God out of the equation by default. So he puts this essay on the shelf in his study in his home at Down House in London, and it sits there for 14 years. Well, in 1858, he gets unexpectedly a parcel in the mail from a biological collector named Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace was a professional biological collector at the time. He was working in the Malay archipelago, so Malaysia, Southeast Asia, for example, and he had spent several years, a number of years there, collecting biological specimens. He would ship them back to London for sale. And he had also, prior to that, worked for about 10 years in the Amazon rainforest. So he had actually seen many of the same things that Darwin had seen that led Darwin to develop his theory of evolution. And believe it or not, Wallace comes up with an almost identical theory of evolutionary change. Even had the same mechanism, natural selection. And he lays all this out in a manuscript that he sends to Darwin. He wanted Darwin to peer review it because he knew that Darwin was working on the species question as well. They knew each other. They were acquaintances anyway. They had talked a little bit. But Wallace had no idea Darwin was as far along on his theory as he was, and Darwin apparently had a little idea that Wallace was working on the same thing. So this comes as quite a shock to Darwin because now he's afraid that he's going to lose primacy. He's going to lose not being given credit for development of evolutionary theory because he's afraid now that Wallace is going to beat him to the punch. So what happens is that Darwin's close scientific associates, several of them convince him to submit his paper to the Linnaean Society. All right, and he does that along with Alfred Russel Wallace's paper because Wallace asked Darwin to submit it to the Linnaean Society. This is a scientific society in London. And here you see the announcement for that. Wallace's paper was titled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. You see by Alfred Russel Wallace. Darwin's paper was called an abstract, but really it was the first edition of The Origin of Species, essentially. And both of these papers were read at a meeting of the Linnaean Society in the summer of 1858. That's a long story. There are entire books written about this episode in natural history. But basically, at the end of it all, Darwin maintains primacy, and ultimately, once he publishes The Origin of Species in late 1859, that establishes that he gets credit for development of the theory. And Wallace even stated he was okay with that because Darwin was much further along in his in development of his theory. So this is Alfred Russel Wallace, okay? And again, he's while he's not considered to be anything like Darwin in terms of the father of evolutionary biology, he does get a lot of credit for sort of lighting a fire under Darwin and getting Darwin to actually publish The Origin of Species. It's possible that Darwin may have never published it before he passed away in 1881. So, Wallace certainly should get credit for that. He's one of the lesser known figures, unfortunately, in natural history. So Darwin publishes The Origin of Species in November 1859, all right? And in that, he lays out two major theses, two major ideas, okay? And the first is descent with modification. So this is Darwin's concept of evolution. Again, Darwin didn't really use the term evolution to describe his theory. He used descent with modification. And basically it says that species diverge from a common ancestor, and as they do so, they're very similar at first, but over time they accumulate differences, and eventually they may come to differ greatly from one another, given enough time. The second major thesis of Darwin's theory of evolution, was, as we've already said, natural selection. This was Darwin's mechanism for evolution, the driver of evolution, what causes it. So Darwin said that useful variations will tend to give their owners a selective advantage, and this should translate into higher reproductive success for them, and the useful variations would be passed to offspring via heredity. So their offspring would be better adapted as well. The important point about this is that natural selection is a variational theory of evolution, okay, as opposed to the transformational theory proposed by Lamarck, wherein individuals change through the course of their lifetimes. That's not what natural selection or evolution by natural selection says. Natural selection works on variation present amongst individuals in a population and selects individuals who happen to be well adapted for higher rates of survival and reproduction. All right, so here's the idea, basically contrasting Darwin's ideas and Lamarck's ideas. On the top we have transformational evolution. So this is Lamarck's concept. Lamarck said that individuals could all be sort of identical at birth, but then over time, over their lifetimes, they become different. They develop characteristics, they acquire characteristics they were not born with. Remember, his concept of evolutionary change, or the mechanism, is inheritance of acquired characteristics. So by the time they reach reproductive age, they're different. They have new features. Then they pass on those new features to the next generation. So the next generation individuals are born with features that were acquired by their parents over their lifetimes. Those individuals in the second generation develop new characters by reproductive age, then pass those on. And so you can see how the individuals change, or the population changes from what it was originally. We know that doesn't happen. Darwin's was a variational theory. Individuals at birth are all different from one another, mostly genetically, somewhat phenotypically as well. And selection will favor some individuals. It works against other individuals who don't survive to reproductive age. Those that do survive pass on their genes, some at higher rates than others. So now you see the characteristics of the population in generation 2 have changed. The proportion of favorable versus unfavorable traits is different than it was in the first generation. And this continues into the third generation, with some individuals reproducing at higher rates. And you can see these darker, more oblong individuals eventually come to dominate the population, whereas the lighter colored circles here basically get weeded out. That's Darwin's concept of variational evolution by natural selection, and this we know happens. All right, so Darwin's theory is really of evolution is really composed of 5 smaller theories. Okay, so I'm going to kind of lay these out here. So number 1, we have the idea that lineage characteristics change over time. Lineage characteristics change over time. Now, this was not Darwin's original idea. Okay, others had proposed it earlier, but Darwin provided substantial and convincing evidence of this sort of change that was ultimately very important for convincing his fellow biologists. All right. Second point, common descent. So second sort of sub-theory of the overall evolutionary theory that Darwin developed. Common descent. Darwin said that new species split off of or diverge from common ancestors such that life can be sort of viewed as a family tree. All right. This is extremely different from Lamarck's proposal. All right. Third, gradualism. All right. Gradualism. Basically, small and large differences all evolve slowly through small steps over long periods of time. This is why Hutton's proposal that the Earth is very old was so important to Darwin developing this theory, because it requires time. And Hutton said that the Earth was actually far older than 6,000 years. He had it pegged at something like 1,000,000 or 2 years. Today we know it's about 4.6 billion years old. All right. Number 4. So subtheory number 4, populational change. Populational change. Evolutionary change occurs as the proportion of individuals with certain characteristics changes. We saw that in the previous slide, comparing Darwin's ideas to Lamarck's ideas. The important point here is that individuals do not evolve. Populations do. The population is the basic unit of evolutionary change. The characteristics of the population in terms of what it's made up of, what proportion of individuals with this feature versus that feature changes over time. So it's the population that evolves as selection weeds out some individuals and favors others from one generation to the next. This was an entirely original idea of Darwin's. All right. Number 5, last sort of sub-theory here. As we've seen, natural selection. So we've discussed this, and this is the explanation for adaptations. This is the explanation for how, or why rather, evolution occurs, okay? Selection explains why adaptations sort of have the appearance of organisms being specifically designed to fit their environment, because the environment selects for certain traits that give individuals an advantage in that environment and favors those, and it works against traits that are not adaptive or are maladaptive, as we say. All right, so Darwin said that evolution and selection work based on variation among individuals. We've established that, okay? And because new variations always arise, he felt there was really no limit to the amount of divergence that could accumulate in a population or between populations over time. The one problem Darwin had is that he had no idea what the source of the variation was. He was never able to answer that key question. Today we know that the variation is at the genetic level in terms of differences in genes. Mutations produce variation. Darwin had no idea about this. No one even knew DNA existed in Darwin's time. All right, that's an important point. So this brings up the problem of what we refer to as blending inheritance. So let me write this down. Oops. Blending inheritance. All right. Blending inheritance was the major concept of how inheritance worked in Darwin's time. Basically, blending inheritance says that inheritance occurs via blending of parental traits, sort of like, mixing yellow and blue paint, for example, would make green, right? This was the prevailing view of inheritance in Darwin's time. And people thought that blending inheritance was the mechanism of inheritance because of the way in which a child can appear to be a blend of parental traits. But there's a problem with blending inheritance, okay? And here it is. Let me kind of give you a sort of conceptual analogy for this. Let's say you have a population of paint buckets or paint cans, and half of them are contain blue paint, half contain yellow paint. And so if we simulate reproduction by taking half of a can of blue paint and mixing it with half of a can of yellow paint to make a new paint can, an offspring in other words, that paint can will contain green paint. Blue and yellow make green, correct? So if all these individuals in this population of blue and yellow paint reproduce, all the F1 offspring will be green. Now, it seems that variation has been reduced, hasn't it? Because now we've gone from a population of parents that had 2 different paint colors to a population of offspring, the F1s, that have 1 paint color. Now, allow these F1 offspring to mate with each other. What do you get when you mix green and green? More green. And so every generation down the line, all you get is green. Blending inheritance would eliminate, ultimately, genetic variation or any kind of variation, even physical variation between individuals. And this was a well-recognized argument against blending inheritance in Darwin's day. And Darwin recognized this, but he simply had no better concept of how inheritance could occur or what the source of variation would be for evolution to work on. And so he sort of ran home to mama and adopted this theory of blending inheritance, which was utterly wrong. That was the one major hole, really the only hole in Darwin's theory of evolution. He got everything else right, but this is the one thing that he really flubbed up on. But nobody in his day had a better idea, except for one person, Gregor Mendel. So Gregor Mendel, the famous Austrian monk who did his classic experiments on inheritance with pea plants in the Abbey Garden in his monastery that he lived in, Gregor Mendel provided the answer. But the problem was that neither he nor Darwin or anybody else of the day recognized it. So Darwin publishes The Origin of Species in 1859. Gregor Mendel's doing his experiments with pea plants in the early 1860s, and he publishes a paper on his results, I believe it was 1864 or 65. And the problem is that no one really read it, or if they did not grasp the significance of it. There have been some authors who have suggested that Darwin actually read Gregor Mendel's paper, but no one knows for sure. If he did read it, he certainly didn't grasp the significance of it. It wasn't until 1901 when two separate biologists, one English, one German, read Mendel's paper and recognized the significance of it. Okay, Gregor Mendel developed a particulate theory of inheritance. A particulate theory of inheritance, where he said particles, today what we call genes, are passed intact from parents to offspring, preserving variation. All right. Now, this still didn't explain why there were different forms of genes. Okay, Gregor Mendel couldn't do that. Today we know that that's mutation, and the concept of mutational changes in genes wasn't developed until after 1900. Okay, so as I said, there were two scientists, two biologists who independently read and understood the significance of Gregor Mendel's work in the early 1900s. And from then on, we had other biologists beginning to work to integrate Mendelian genetics into Darwin's evolutionary theory. And so by the 1930s, 1940s, it was well integrated into Darwinian evolution, and we had something called the modern synthesis as a result. The modern synthesis is our current and most up-to-date conceptual view of how Darwinian evolution occurs. And again, we call it the modern synthesis or neo-Darwinism, as you also may hear it referred to, because it includes Mendelian genetics and mutational change as a driver of genetic variation that natural selection can then operate on. So again, this modern idea of Darwinian evolution is referred to as the modern synthesis. Okay. All right. Now, there were three researchers who were very critical in terms of integrating Mendelian inheritance into classical Darwinian evolution. These three were Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewall Wright. Basically, they developed the mathematical foundations of modern population genetics. Okay, this is why the course that you're in right now is called Evolutionary Biology and Population Genetics, because it's all about the modern synthesis. These three, through a mathematical approach, showed that mutation provides raw material, genetic variation, for natural selection to operate on. All right, now Fisher and Haldane, there on the left, and in the middle were both English biologists. Sewall Wright on the right was an American biologist. And by the way, R.A. Fisher is not only famous for his work in terms of helping to develop the modern synthesis, He's also famous for all the different statistical analyses he developed. You can take a stats course in psychology, for example, or a business statistics course, and you'll see Fisher's name mentioned because he helped develop the mathematical underpinnings of modern statistical analysis. So, really quite a lot of contributions were made by Fisher. Okay, so basically today there are a number of different principles that are all sort of rolled up into the modern synthesis. And I decided to go ahead and print and just leave those here on the slide typed out rather than writing with the Apple Pencil because there's so much here. So let's just go through these. Today, the modern synthesis principles are the following. Okay, first of all, phenotype and genotype are different, and the differences are due to genetics and the environment. Okay, so the environment can make the phenotype different just as genetics can. But think of genetics as sort of like the hardwiring of the phenotype. Remember, the phenotype is the physical appearance of an organism, morphology, for example. The genotype is the genetic makeup. So think of the genotype as the hardwiring and the phenotype as the result of that. But the environment can modify the phenotype as well, to some extent, although not necessarily in a way that's heritable to the next generation. That would be Lamarckian. All right. 2, genotype is not affected by the environment. Okay, that's an important point. The genotype is not affected by the environment. That's just another way of saying that acquired characteristics are not inherited. I can go out and lay on the beach and get a sunburn or a suntan, but I can't pass on that darker skin tone to my offspring. That would be Lamarckian, right? My skin tone is at a baseline controlled by the genotype. The phenotype, the skin tone, can be affected by the environment, but only in my case. It's not heritable. I can't pass that on. 3, inheritance is particulate, not blending. So this is, leading back to Gregor Mendel's concept of particulate inheritance, and basically saying that genes are passed intact to subsequent generations. They don't blend together. Your parents' genes don't blend together to make you. You have an independent copy of your mom's gene A and an independent copy of your father's gene A. They're separate biological entities. They don't blend together. 4, mutation produces alternate forms of genes. These are called alleles. That's an important term. You should know that term. Okay. Alleles are alternate forms of the same gene. Sexual recombination amplifies variation produced by mutation by causing alleles to come together in potentially new combinations that never existed before. All right, that's important. Okay, 5, evolution occurs at the level of the population, as I've said before, and this is basically through genotype proportions that change over time, what we call genotype frequencies. A frequency just means how common a genotype is, right? If 25% of the population has genotype AA and 75% has genotype or heterozygous genotype AA, then this is the more common. These frequencies can change from one generation to the next, and that's the most basic definition for what evolution is. All right, 6, 2 forces, genetic drift and natural selection, cause shifts in genotype frequencies. Mutation can introduce a new gene, a new genotype in one generation, but it may be only in one individual or a few individuals, and so it's not common enough to drastically change the frequencies of existing genotypes. But 2 forces that we'll talk about quite a bit this semester, genetic drift and natural selection, can cause shifts, sometimes dramatic shifts in genotype frequencies. But it's important to recognize that mutation is the only force that can produce new alleles, new versions of genes. 7, natural selection accounts for adaptations. Even moderate selection pressure can cause significant change. So, natural selection sort of fine-tunes populations to better deal with their environment. Only selection consistently does this. Selection is not random. Selection is directional, always taking a population in the direction of being more fit or better adapted to existing environmental conditions. All right, 8, mutation can store up genetic variability in populations. This makes it possible for a population to evolve rapidly if the environment changes. So we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but basically it has to do with recessive genes, genes that are present but are not affecting the phenotype. They are there, and that could be a good thing because who knows, the environment could change in the future and that recessive gene could all of a sudden be a benefit. And so if it's there, then it's sort of like having tools in your toolbox that you rarely, if ever, use. When you need it, you got it, that kind of thing. 9, distinct populations of the same species typically exhibit geographic distinctiveness, and the differences have a genetic component. This is just saying that certain characteristics are adaptive in one environment, but not necessarily in another environment 300 miles away. So geographic differences in location of populations of the same species can result in them diverging from one another because they might be different or subject to different local conditions. Selection pressures may be different in those separated populations. 10, genetic differences between populations often consist of multiple small differences across many loci or genes, each difference causing only small phenotypic effects. This supports the hypothesis that differences between species often evolve via very small steps. So real quick, one definition here. So you see loci there. That's plural for locus. A locus just means the location of a gene. So a locus is a gene, right? Where you find it on a chromosome. So loci just means multiple genes. Okay. 11. Species are defined reproductively when we can do this, when possible. We can't do this with extinct species that only exist as fossils, for example. And therefore, these species represent distinctive gene pools. This is an important point. Species are groups of interbreeding organisms that do not exchange genes with other groups. That's the biological species concept. It's the most useful and clear-cut definition for what species are. We have an entire chapter on definition of species later on. You'll see that defining species isn't always very easy, not like you would think it would be. 12. Speciation occurs as one ancestral species splits into two or more descendant species. So isolated populations accumulate distinct mutations, and variable selection pressures in geographically isolated populations can then force gene pools along different evolutionary trajectories. So speciation is a process whereby one ancestral species splits into two or more descendant species, and this can happen because that initial species is existing in physically separated populations that begin to diverge from one another because they're subject to different environmental conditions, and selection acts on them each differently. All right. 13. Evolutionary changes are cumulative, so that ever greater differences occur between species as we compare organisms from lower taxa, such as genera and species, to higher taxa, like orders, families, phyla, that sort of thing. This is good evidence that higher taxa evolve by accumulation of small differences and not by rapid origin of new forms by large mutational changes. And this sort of goes back to Darwin's idea of gradualism that we talked about. All right, finally, evolution has produced a tree of life. That's what this little figure is over here on the right of all these slides. This is referred to as a phylogeny, an evolutionary history. So evolution produces phylogenies as descendant species diverge from ancestral species. And all species ultimately evolve from the same common ancestor, what will be the trunk of the tree, basically. If this is true, and there's mountains of evidence telling us that it is, that means that all species living today can be traced back to ultimately one common ancestor, what we think was probably an early bacterium that lived maybe about 3.8 billion years ago. All right, finally, Darwin took all of this, well, not the modern synthesis stuff, but his classical Darwinian evolutionary concepts, and very nicely put it together in The Origin of Species. And the last line of The Origin of Species is really telling. It's really important because it sort of sums all this up. So let me just read that last line of The Origin of Species. Darwin said, "There's grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." And that just very eloquently, I think, sums up his concept of classical evolution. All right, that finishes chapter 1.